We now return to Motor City Burning, a special presentation of WILS News.
The Detroit Free Press described Thursday, July 27th as the first day of real peace since the beginning of the riot. At Cyrus Vance's urging, Governor Romney lifted the 5:30 a.m. to 9 p.m. curfew and removed all gasoline restrictions, with the exception for the sale of gas in portable containers. 4 days later, the governor reopened liquor establishments, and 1 day later, lifted the curfew entirely. Vance declared that law and order had been restored to Detroit on August 2nd, the same day the last federal paratroopers left the city. According to the American Insurance Association, 2,509 stores were looted, burned, or destroyed by the riot, and insured losses totaled $75 to $80 million. Detroit hospitals treated nearly 1,200 people for injuries, almost twice the number the Detroit Police Department acknowledged. The official death toll was 43. 30 of those were slain by law enforcement officers. The controversy regarding the number of deaths from the riot remains 4 decades later. State Trooper Craig Grunow and his partners spent their second night in Detroit guarding Detroit Receiving Hospital. Because of what the two of them saw that night, Grunow believes that the death toll of 43 is inaccurate. He also explains how authorities can alter statistics in times of mass crisis and confusion.
One of the things that we observed was in the course of the night they had for lack of a better term, a meat wagon. And this meat wagon, I think, held 16 bodies. And we watched them fill that twice in the course of the night, take them to a morgue. And then the next morning, my partner, out of curiosity, went around the front desk and said to the gal at the front desk, how many people passed away overnight? And she gave us a figure that was probably half of what we saw that leave there. So the accuracy of the dead, from our perspective, was not near what we were seeing were real things, and what they were telling the public was something different. I'll tell you a statement. You can make your own conclusions from this, but we were talking to a Detroit City detective that had worked out of the first precinct, or out of the first Detroit Receiving, and a body went out of there that had been stabbed in the back. And what these guys try and do is clear everything they possibly can as fast as they can. They want an end result to it. And this guy went out of there with severe stab wounds in the back, and I thought this Detroit detective, and he looked at me and he said, "Worst case of suicide I've ever seen."
Free Press reporter Bill Sarin believes the official death toll of 43 is accurate.
Oh, God, no. You can't hide bodies. I don't see how you could hide those bodies. I think we had it pretty cold. And also, you know what? Over at the police beat, we had these old crazy at the right, where these old-timers who were very close to the cops. These guys have been working the police beat for 25, 35, 40 years. But they were honest guys. And they would not have let them hide any deaths. I'm firmly convinced of that.
By the end of that horrific July, President Lyndon Johnson formed an 11-member National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders to explain the riots that plagued cities each summer since 1964 and to provide recommendations for the future.
The American people are deeply disturbed. No society can tolerate massive violence any more than a body can tolerate massive disease. And we in America shall not tolerate it. But just saying that does not solve the problem. We need to know the answer, I think, to 3 basic questions about these riots. What happened? Why did it happen? What can be done to prevent it from happening again and again? I'll be doomed till the day I
die. The Commission's 1968 report, informally known as the Kerner Report, concluded that the nation was, quote, moving toward 2 societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal, unquote. Unless conditions were remedied, the Commission warned, the country faced a system of apartheid in its major cities. The Kerner Report delivered an indictment of white society for isolating and neglecting African Americans and urged legislation to promote racial integration and to enrich slums, primarily through the creation of jobs, job training programs, and decent housing. President Johnson, the architect and head cheerleader of the Great Society reforms earlier in the decade, turned his back on that society and rejected the recommendations. In 1998, 30 years after the first report was issued, Former Senator and Commission member Fred R. Harris co-authored another study that found that the racial divide had grown in the ensuing years and that inner-city unemployment had reached unprecedented levels. One of the first authorities to deal honestly with the riot and its aftermath was Governor George Romney. Chuck Harmon explains.
Later on in 67, he made a decision after a kind of a stop-and-start process dealing with whether or not we should push for an Open Housing Act as a major civil rights act in the state of Michigan. We felt that in the new Michigan Constitution, which had occurred earlier in the 60s, that the civil rights clause of that Constitution, as well as the fact that we had, unlike any other state, a state civil rights commission, would be sufficient and that we didn't need a law. But it became clear to him as he moved around the country later on in the summertime and early fall that people were asking the question, why aren't you doing this? And finally in October, he sent a special message to the legislature calling for the adoption of a Open Housing Act. He didn't succeed the first time around. The legislature turned it down very, very stupidly, but they did. At that time, the organized real estate brokers' interests did not want that law, and they fought very hard against it. And there was a lot of lobbying done to stop. George was not one to throw in the towel if he lost the first time. And so he came back after him, bolstered his resources, and got a lot of support from people. He got the presidents of the big three auto companies to support that effort, and they agreed, and they put their people on it, and we got that sucker through the legislature after a lot of work and a lot of opposition.
Meanwhile, in Washington, presidential politics and George Romney remained on the mind of Lyndon Johnson, as this 1978 CBS report explains.
No city was harder hit by riots during the racial turmoil of 1967 than Detroit. The causes of those disturbances excited instant attention, and as Bob Fall reports, a search directed from the White House for a conspiracy that was never found.
Rioting in Detroit began July 23, 1967, and when it ended 8 days later, many politicians felt the riots were started by radical groups which conspired to incite violence. But 1,300 pages of FBI documents just released under the Freedom of Information Act show that despite tips from Gerald Ford, Spiro Agnew, and top Justice Department executives, police agencies were unable to find any evidence of conspiracy. What the documents do show is that former President Lyndon Johnson repeatedly pressured then FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to find information which could embarrass Michigan Governor George Romney, then a leading presidential hopeful. A White House aide quoted in this memo of August 3, 1967, asked Hoover to obtain Romney's radio tapes to show, quote, that Governor Romney had vacillated back and forth as to whether federal troops should be called into Detroit. The memo adding, quote, the White House did not desire for anyone outside to realize that they were attempting to obtain these tapes for the president. Asked about the memo, Romney said that because of politics, federal troops were deployed 12 hours late, and then only after he was forced to concede in writing that the situation was out of control. The documents also show that President Johnson was so certain there was a conspiracy, Hoover said Johnson told him, quote, to keep my men busy to find a central character to it, to watch and see, and we will find some central theme. But the FBI did not. Bob Fall, CBS News, Detroit.
Motor City Burning, a special presentation of WILS News, will continue in a moment.